Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Alexa Brahmi. I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic, and we are so excited to have Ari Richter and Rachel Dry with us tonight. Let's give them a round of applause. As you know, tonight we're celebrating Ari's graphic memoir, Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz. But before we get started, I just want to point out some logistics for how tonight's event is going to go. We'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A at the end, so start thinking about some questions now. And then after the talk tonight, Ari will be signing and personalizing books at the table near the front. I'll point to that again at the end of the event. And then if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz online using the link in the live stream description. All right. Told from the perspectives of 4 generations of families spanning pre-war Germany to post-Trump America, Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz is a celebration of Jewish cultural resilience and a warning of democracy's fragility in the face of authoritarianism. Part travelogue, memoir, and history retelling, Ari Richter creates his family's journey leading up and extending beyond the Holocaust. Ari Richter is a visual artist and professor at the City University of New York. His drawings, sculptures, videos, performances, and lectures have been presented in museums, galleries, and academic spaces throughout the U.S. Ari is the recipient of fellowships from the Mellon Foundation and the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. The grandson of Holocaust survivors and son of therapists, he lives in New York City with his wife and daughters. Rachel Dry, joining us tonight, is an editor at the New York Times, currently focused on the 2024 election with the Run Up podcast. Previously, she edited the paper's Sunday Business and Sunday Review sections. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Ari and Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here. And such a pleasure that people are going to get a little peek at the work right now. So I'll hand it over to you.
A great pleasure for me. So I'm going to start off with what I hope is a tight 5 of I'm going to give a visual presentation. It's not going to be like a chronological like reading in that conventional sense. I'm kind of like hitting some marks that the book covers, and so we'll take it away. Perfect. Okay, so the first chapter starts off in Tampa, Florida. Oh, and I have to look over here because it's not on my screen. And I'll read some of it, some of it I'll describe. So, less than New Yorkers' vision of Boca Boobies and South Beach sophisticates, Central Florida was a land of highways to suburbs and exurbs filled with chain stores, megachurches, and functionally segregated school districts. Cameo from the second largest Confederate flag in the world. Sports were at the absolute center of social life, and my creative pursuits had little cultural sway. And also a cameo there from Tampa's favorite son, Hulk Hogan, who is also somehow still culturally relevant today.
Question mark.
Still there. It's not that I totally lacked Jewish peers. I went to religious school every Sunday, but with some of the waspiest Jews who ever dared to assimilate. The country club, playing football, everyone's sporting Ralph Lauren, who those in the know that the patron saint of sporty Jewish American assimilation. I washed myself in a purifying bath of pop culture. That was my assimilation shtick. My parents had done the same before me, and our favorite stars, proved it was possible for Jews to cleanse our otherness to become honest-to-God, red-blooded Americans. My grandparents, 3 of whom are Holocaust survivors, I grew up with their stories, which were like dispatches from an inverted world on fire. I could scarcely relate, and we'll get into more of that. My own encounters with anti-Semitism were often subtle, like the time I was pushed into fighting the only other Jewish kid at a 4th grade slumber party. You can't read the annotation. He was already an advanced belt in karate. It was not a fair fight. He was both a martial arts code violator and an anti-Semitic collaborator, as far as I'm concerned. And he's now actually a fairly popular stand-up comedian, so I wish him all the best, but I did not invite him to the book event. Mostly, though, it was just out of cluelessness. Ari, you should come to my church sometime. I'm Jewish, right? It's fine. My pastor says that anyone can be saved. And subtext is that her father was the pastor. Okay, and now first, next section. First of the beautiful chapter headings designed by Dana Collins. Just want to shout out there. The Tree of Life itself, the Tree of Life Massacre, was a major turning point in my own personal development as well as the development of this book. In an instant, my sense of security had been upended. I began connecting the dots through events that I previously shrugged off. It was like flipping on a light in a dark room, exposing something sinister that had been hiding there all along. I could finally see myself reflected as I had never dared to see myself before, as the other. One day in the studio, I began to search through some documents I had on hand. My grandfathers, both having been amateur family historians and genealogists, and they wrote about two very different German-Jewish experiences. The cosmopolitan lives of Grandpa Karl and Grandma Ruth's families in Germany's urban centers of Stuttgart, Breslau, and Berlin, and the hardscrabble existence of Grandpa Jack's family in Germany's rural southwest. There's an image of me literally drowning in ephemera once. I have a lot of documentation. We'll talk about this with Rachel, but once the word was out about my book, everyone in my family just started sending everything that they had in their own dusty basements or file cabinets to me, which I still have. Okay, the next chapter is a love story. The rabbi will be hanged in the stadium next Sunday about my Richter grandparents, Rabbi Karl and Ruth Richter, who met in Breslau, Germany, when my grandfather Karl was a student at the Breslau Theological Seminary, and his soon-to-be 16-year-old bride was the daughter of a trustee at the seminary. But they were different times, and they lived a happy life despite that.
He was only 20.
Yeah. So they. He's 23. But
23.
so they. Okay, let's get serious. We're getting to serious stuff now. So they ended up they ended up being in charge of a congregation in Mannheim, Germany, that then on Kristallnacht was dynamited by the local Nazis, and that was the result of that beautiful synagogue of theirs. Pigeons flying in and out of the roof. Oh, and it's worth mentioning all of my ancestor chapters, including this one, they're all narrated by my ancestors themselves, all the documentation I have. In this case, closed captioning aesthetic from my grandfather, who did a lot of interviews, including the Shoah Foundation at the University of Southern California. Whoopsie. Uh-oh. Something's happening. Okay. So then they ended up in hiding at a Jewish hospital in Mannheim, where all the other victims of the night of Kristallnacht were convalescing, and he was hidden, my grandfather, the rabbi, in the infectious diseases ward, where they figured the Nazis would not look for them. He then got shuttled to Stuttgart, where he's from, to a non-Jewish family friend's home, where he hid in the attic for some time, as the nephew of this couple, who was a Nazi stormtrooper, came and went, unknowing of my grandfather up there. And then they eventually got a non-quota visa to the United States for clergy, where he would oversee a congregation in Springfield, Missouri. And my grandmother, always fast thinking on her feet, changed his answer on the telegraph to the congregation about his English skills, which he was like, I know a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and she changed it to English perfect, and that sealed the deal, even though his English was not perfect. And that is the gist of their story. And then one more ancestor story. There's so much more in this book, but this is the last thing because I want to keep this. I'm going to slow it down as my wife is mouthing to me right now. That's what happened is the story of my mother's father, Jack Honig, who grew up in a very different place in rural southwestern Germany, the Rhineland-Pfalz, Rhineland-Palatinate region. Grandpa aloof and quick-tempered, Grandpa Jack was an imposing figure. He was a middle school shop teacher in suburban New Jersey, where my mother grew up, and he carried a lot of baggage with him and a lot of anger. Growing up in rural Alsens, he was regularly assaulted by classmates, ridiculed by teachers, and generally menaced by the adults in his community. This is actually a literal song that he said in his own memoir, that is, Butcher would sing, "Butcher, hone your slaughtering knife on the synagogue stone so it cuts better into the Jew folk," was a song that his butcher would sing while he was in the shop. Jack After high school, worked for his uncle in a bake shop in Neustadt, and was then arrested on Kristallnacht with his uncle and sent to Dachau, and suffered all of the dehumanizing hallmarks of that experience: the shearing, the uniform, the star, the number. After he was released after a number of months, and essentially got himself on a kinder transport, a child transport vessel out of Germany. He was, like you can see, he was like a very old teenager, definitely not a priority for the kinder transport set, but got himself to the US and to London first and then to the US, where but while he was gone, his mother and grandmother who raised him, as well as his uncle and aunt, who were his other close family, were all sent to camps and murdered. So grandmother in Gurs, mother and uncle and aunt in Auschwitz. When he got to the U.S., he actually was then he then became a soldier in the U.S. Army, sent back to Germany to fight near the end of the war. And as did his brother Jules, who has a very similar kind of story. But Grandpa Jack always alluded to having exacted some amount of extrajudicial punishment during the war. I'm asking my grandfather as a child, what was it like going back to Germany as a soldier? He says, well, it was cathartic. I got to settle some old scores. And he kind of left it at that. But of course, my imagination always ran wild with the violent potential of his arc from victim to victor to vengeance taker. I tackle some of that in the final part of the book. This is basically the first 2/3 of the book, and then the final third is really me taking all of this information and synthesizing it into something that I can move forward with in my own life, and as well as some travel log stuff, going to Auschwitz and going to other sites in Germany and Poland related to my family. But that's the presentation. So, thank you. Now go home. That was it. No, I'm just kidding.
That was incredible. I'm so thrilled that you got to see some of the book here, and excited for everyone to get to read it. It obviously chronicles the darkest thing in humanity, but it's also very funny. I think you got a little taste of that there. And so we're going to talk about the dark and the light here tonight. So I just want to start. The title is Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz. And my question is but are you glad you went the one time? Should we all go the one time? But mostly, I mean, the way you told this story, you started with a lot of the family history and the documents, and then went to see for yourself these places. And I wondered if you could talk about what it meant to actually go and physically be there.
Great question. And I needed to go myself to write this book. It would not have been possible if I had not gone. The context is that I wrote an initial 8-page graphic essay that became one of the chapters in this book and inspired the title, of course, also called Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz. And it was in summer 2019. My wife Erin and I went while I was kind of planning for this book. And we planned to have an experience there. It's a very, it's almost like a hallowed site. It's the site of so much suffering and so much pain. And, I expected to have a real, kind of communing almost with the grounds there. But I wasn't able to have that experience for a number of reasons, including the disorganization of the site. It's run by the Polish state government in just a very kind of haphazard seeming way. But also, it's the focus of the whole operation, when you take the guided tour, the English language tour, is focused on non-Jewish Polish suffering at Auschwitz, which for sure happened, and many Polish people suffered and died there, but proportionally not in the same number as the Jewish and mostly, frankly, Polish Jewish population that was that was suffered there. So I didn't get to have that experience that I wanted to, but I will never go back to Auschwitz for that particular reason. But again, I would not have had the impetus to write this book in the way I did without having that experience.
And then also visiting the rural area where your grandfather had come from. Yeah, what role did that play in being able to tell his story?
Yeah, I had to go a couple times for that to really click. The first time I went in that same trip, 2019, with Erin, and I just didn't plan enough that trip. I was just gonna go and like wander around, see what I could find, and it's just like I felt it was a very alienating feeling experience. Just knowing like what was, just what had happened in that space, and what, just what the version of it in my mind was so, expanded beyond what even was there. But the next time I went, in 2021, I believe, it was like, early COVID times. And I set up more. I actually ended up, getting a tour from the mayor of Alsens, who, was lovely and wonderful, and other dignitaries and kind of local historians and this kind of thing. So I had a very, very different kind of experience that I took away a very different feeling from. But I was able to get all the kind of the documentation, visual documentation I needed, as well as experiential documentation.
So on the documentation point, you alluded to it in the presentation, but I wondered if you could tell people about the real documents you're working with, because it's a pretty incredible family archive. And I want you specifically to say the titles and also the fonts that your grandfather chose, or how you chose to artistically render them.
Right.
It's quite remarkable to have access, that you had access to that, and then also what you were able to make out of it. And wonder what it was like to be working with that record. Yeah, so I mean, the amount of ephemera and documents that I had to work with was, like in the, hundreds, if not thousands of pages of text, as well as thousands of, hundreds of thousands of photographs and audio recordings, video recordings. But so I was very lucky on that front. But so some of the specific examples, I have the onion skin testimonial, which unfortunately I didn't show any of my great-grandfather Richard May's story, who was one of the first ancestor stories I illustrate in the book, who was arrested on Kristallnacht he was my grandmother's father, so he lived in Breslau, was arrested in Breslau, sent to Buchenwald concentration camp as an old man, and suffered a lot there. But he wrote his experience down before he died in the late 1940s, and on this onion skin testimonial. So I had this onion skin paper that his main testimonial was on, and then he expanded that into a 177-page autobiographical, a memoir called The Wheels of Fate, which I named his chapter after, very evocative, and I tried for each chapter with the narration of my ancestors' voices, I use these kind of facsimiles of the different documentation texts that they were. So his onion skin testimonial and this typewriter aesthetic on transparent paper is what his narrative voice is displayed through. My grandpa Jack, who wrote a very, That's What Happened, you saw. So That's What Happened, very unevocative, the least evocative possible title. I think it's great. Although in the running with his brothers, Jules' memoir called My Life, also incredibly non-evocative titles for very evocative stories. Also, about. Yeah. And they both wrote theirs on late 80s, early 90s dot matrix printer, printouts with that aesthetic for their voices and that different color coding. And then my grandfather Rabbi Carl Richter, he told his story countless times, over his lifetime, and as well as including to the USC Shoah Foundation. So I have him as this closed captioning aesthetic to really show his the recorded nature. So you mentioned aesthetics, and I want to ask you about aesthetics, and I want to ask you because you told me to ask you. But I think it's notable that it didn't occur. It's not just because I'm not an artist myself that I didn't think about it. It's so seamless. Obviously, when I zoom out and think about the choices you made, they're incredibly thoughtful, intentional choices. But the way in which each person's story is rendered in a distinct style that sort of unifies around the style that you chose to talk about your own life and the inheritance that comes from each of the different parts. If at the end I didn't feel wow, Ari was doing a lot of work there. I thought what a beautiful symphony of all these different styles. But I did wonder if you could talk a bit about the choices you made that were so perfectly made that a lay observer missed them, and who your influences were and what you were drawing on. Absolutely, thank you. So the
each chapter I really saw as like a standalone passage. They all work together for a common narrative, but each one can be kind of taken on their own. So for each chapter, I worked out different aesthetic influences, as Rachel was pointing out. As the examples, the first chapter, growing up in Tampa, it's a little bit lighter, a little bit breezier, a little bit more kind of cartoony. So I was thinking about the Sunday funnies that I grew up reading, and just that kind of like, little kid Dennis the Menace aesthetic, of cartooning. Whereas with some of the other ancestor chapters, for instance, the Ruth and Carl chapter that I showed you, like they documented their story for, like endlessly over decades. So it was like a very like crystallized story. And there was so much like written documentation, photographic documentation of them. So I wanted that one to have a very photographically based aesthetic. A lot of my work is built on collage, like image collage that I draw over anyway. So I just like leaned into that particular bit for their story. The Grandpa Jack story is almost like that first aesthetic I'm talking about with like the Sunday funnies, but kind of like mutated in a more kind of grotesque way. Based on his own experience, of course. And then the one that I did not show, Richard May, my great-grandfather who was sent to Buchenwald, that one I was actually thinking very clearly about German expressionist aesthetics, so like Max Beckmann, for instance, and Otto Dix, and I was just thinking about this particular time period that would have been contemporaneous with his experience, especially as an older person, in pre-war Germany at that time. And so like more painterly, more like kind of like outrageous colors and that kind of thing.
And thank you. I totally got the German expressionism. You guys are gonna get it too. It's really obvious once you say it. We were talking a bit about obviously the wealth of source material, and one way that I feel like that expresses itself is in the detail, the extremely carefully chosen and quite evocative detail. I'm thinking about, you have a little note that the company that made the ovens at Auschwitz was in business until 2012, which I read that and I thought like, whoa, like,
that was the ovens at Dachau.
Oh, Dachau, right. Excuse me, sorry. Well, right, so no, we're talking about details.
We're talking
right.
details here.
I was struck in I believe your great-grandfather's recollection talking about the zoo that the Nazis set up at Dachau there.
That's Buchenwald.
Buchenwald. Okay, that's truly embarrassing to get that wrong, but speaks to the overwhelming horrors that are metabolized in this work. So it was on purpose that I got that wrong. And he mentions, you select this observation that he mentions, the animals were very well fed because there was no shortage of material to feed on, that's brutal. Corpses, right, sorry. Brutal, evocative, but such a level of detail that you are obviously immersed in as you were working on this project. And I wonder if you could talk about that emotional experience of, you can't really distance yourself when you're reading your great-grandfather's, account of the vultures who were fat and happy. And I wonder about, and the way you chose the details as well.
Yeah, well, it's very much related to this idea of visualizing the horror. So it's something that we talked about previously, but also about there's a chapter where I'm talking about drawing my great grandfather's experience at Buchenwald as a way of almost like exorcising the demon, of like naming the thing that's in my head that's looming so large and so horrific, and by somehow visualizing it makes it easier to take in. But I think the same thing applies to the details. It's like just rendering everything that I can find. Like going down whatever rabbit hole gets me to the truth or the root of the situation. And then it clearly doesn't fully exorcise the demons, but it maybe makes it I keep thinking about it in relation to like old monster movie horror films where like you never see the monster until the end, and it's always like it looms scarier in your imagination before you see it, and then you see it's usually a little bit of a letdown, but
that's a really incredible way to think about what details can do in terms of helping you reckon with the whole of what you're trying to reckon with. And I'm now doubting that this is where I want to go next, but I'm going to go there anyway because the book is very funny. And I mentioned that I thought some of the tone that in your grandfather's and your great-grandfather's memoir, that some of that was quite funny too, and you gently said that might be open to interpretation. Like, I thought the way the zoo observation was written was quite, I thought, oh, he was making jokes to pass the time. But certainly the way you render your own experience and the way you lived with this, humor in the face of something challenging is quite present. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the value, when it feels like the right thing to reach for, when it doesn't. I mean, that every Jew in Tampa was named Tyler. I forget what their names are. But obviously the late 80s are a little bit easier than 1939 in Breslau to make jokes about. But certainly I felt that the observation of the details and the humanity that is present all the way through is very imbued with humor, and I wonder if you could talk about those choices.
Yeah, I mean, and this is really just a personal thing that I personally use humor to process trauma, but really, I mean, everything in my life. I mean, it's very important to me. I mean, it's it's a way of just kind of like laughing at the impossible, at the absurd. I think it's something that a lot of times when people talk about Jewish humor, quote unquote Jewish humor, they're talking about this propensity to just laugh at the horror, to laugh at what you can't control, to laugh at to laugh at the oppression, to laugh at just the world that seems to be conspiring against you. And I definitely, I carry that with me. I don't think that every Jew is goes through life that way. I mean, like my dad's parents were very kind of optimistic. My grandpa Carl was like always just like making jokes, cracking jokes about everything he could. My mom's father, Grandpa Jack, like he was a very deeply, traumatized person. I don't think that humor really was that salve for him. His particular brand of humor was a lot more also kind of like sadistic. He was like his favorite, like he would like, there's a scene in the book where he's like reading to me his favorite book, Struwwelpeter, if anybody knows, German children's classics of just children dying and being like tortured in different ways because they didn't follow the rules or whatever. But
a precious family memory, all right? Yeah. I wondered, give them the cover again. All right, well, you know what, you have it in your laps. I wondered if you could talk about how you thought about luck before you started this project and how you think about it now. There are so many moments, and of course, it's a narrative. We're looking back. You've chosen how you're telling this story, but I'm thinking specifically of your grandfather, I believe, had moved to Mannheim 8 months before all the Jews in Mannheim were rounded up, and the list they were using was people who lived there for a year. And there are a couple other moments where it's all a clerical horror, and it fell the sort of right side for you to be sitting here and for us all to be here this evening hearing your story. And I wonder what it's like to think about luck as you're living with these documents and these stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a disquieting experience to like investigate all these stories so deeply and understand how incredibly luck played in every step of the way for each of these figures. And it's like, I try not to dwell on that too much because it's a little bit crazy making, but something I think a lot about, I think about survivor's guilt a lot, what it means that, that my family survived, other people didn't, but also I think about survivor's bias a lot in this conversation too, thinking about, we sometimes try to justify after the fact, reverse justify, well, why did these particular people make it, but it's luck.
Yeah. Well, it's luck, and then let's take a moment for Grandma Ruth, who you showed a little bit. Yeah, her husband had written quick to learn, and she looks at the telegram and is like, what is this? And scratches it out and says, English perfect.
That's right.
So he was lucky that he married Ruth.
Right, that was the biggest lucky ever.
But I wondered, so connected to the idea of luck, the idea of, as we understand our family story and as it really happened, that these people took an action that led to it working.
And certainly, as we reverse justify, why these people survived, other people didn't. There were definitely, I'm like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of like incredibly like, pushy, chutzpahnik Jews who ended up to their death regardless of this, right? Or
Right.
very optimistic people who still ended up to their death. But there certainly are traits that will get you maybe that step ahead, that leg up. You look for that way out. You try to find that. Whatever that might be. But of course, at the end of the day, like that's that will only take you so far.
I think we've sort of talked around this. It's certainly evident in the extremely thoughtful way you're talking about this experience for you. But I wonder if you could talk about really what it was like to live with these stories. And then there's a part, sort of, I think it's towards the beginning, where you talk about how useful and necessary it was, to read it, take it in what had happened, and then draw it. And then I forget, for me, I think you said you put it in a drawer or something. The sort of necessity and value of capturing it and the way you captured it, and how that makes it possible to walk around knowing all of this that you now know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I have the information. I mean, I definitely took the, whatever color pill that is. I went all in through the rabbit hole of this information. It's all stuff I grew up with. I had some version of this in my mind, and my family was always very open, I think, about their experiences, especially my dad's parents, my mom's father, like later in life, I think after my grandmother kind of forced him into therapy, started actually then talking about, and of course writing down his experiences. But these were always in my childhood, in my my imagination. Then it's just like really sitting down and realizing that I was going to have to take on this role of being the the keeper of this information, because I mean there's other people in my family too. My sister Samara is actually an amazing, she was interviewing my grandparents when they were still alive. I never had the the wherewithal to do that or the interest to do that. I wouldn't have been able to write this book any time before I did. I just didn't have maybe the maturity or the focus to do that. But I'm actually getting off the topic of the question.
Well, no, I was thinking about the process of, putting it down on the page.
Yeah, and it didn't change anything for me though, which is what is kind of the big surprise. It's it gave me the information, but it didn't exercise those demons. It didn't put those stories to rest. I did get to put the drawings in a flat file drawer and close the door and finish the book and delete the folder from my local drive, but. It's still I'm still living with it. I'm still it's all up there, but it's having to feeling this necessity to carry this torch, because my grandparents and my great grandparents, they wanted their stories told. They wrote these stories down to be shared. So I feel I owed that to them to continue that to carry the torch for them.
I was curious. You talked about you traveled twice to Germany and reporting the book, and you have a really fascinating section, I thought, on sort of German historical memory and how contemporary Germans are reckoning with their past. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about what it was like. I'm thinking specifically of you have a very, I would say, funny section of being like, wow, these people, this is all they're going to talk about. Here, or just it's very present for contemporary Germans, and what sort of that experience and understanding how, sort of, I guess, cultural contemporaries in Germany today talk about this history.
It's such a culture of remembrance. I mean, it was actually, I was actually taken aback very much when I first went there, and just to see how much the average German person lives with that past and reckons with that past. And it's very inspiring. It's a little bit I actually found it a little bit kind of put me off kilter, because I really didn't expect that in particular. But I have great admiration for that particular drive. But I talk about in the book the culture of remembrance in Germany versus the one I experienced in Poland. I just directly compare at one point the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial in Poland versus the Dachau Memorial in Germany, which I also visited, and they couldn't be more different. They're diametrically opposite. The Auschwitz, the memorial, this kind of decaying, crumbling structures, and just all this history, just in that soil there. Whereas the Dachau Memorial completely cleaned up, fixed up, serviced in the most German possible way of showing reverence for a space. Is clearly where the intention comes from, but in effect whitewashing the space, completely sanitizing it. It is no longer that place anymore. It's that that thought experiment about rebuilding of the boat and how at what point is it still the same boat, right? So it's but so and and those ovens at Dachau that like I was able to see like the little manufacturers insignia, and I looked it up, and like they were in business, probably still servicing this thing until 2012, and when they went out of business. And so it's like, but again, that's the very German thing. Whereas like so I kind of like compare and contrast those things and think, well, in some ways, of course I respect that, but I also like in some ways I prefer that crumbling realness of Auschwitz. It's like, it like will carry, it'll carry the history and the people and the stories with it as it crumples into dust.
I want to end we're going to take questions from you in a moment, but I wanted to end our conversation on the subject of optimism. You alluded to your grandfather's optimism, and towards the end you quote him as saying, "I am ultimately an optimist. I have to be, because the haters have won if they succeed in hardening your heart." And so at the end of this project, as it's out in the world and people are receiving and living with it, are you ultimately an optimist?
I mean, I am, and that's something I definitely inherited from from my dad's parents in particular, and it's the only way that I can try to reckon with this past. But much of the end of the book is about my experience as like a first-time father. I've become a father twice over the course of the last part of the narrative in the book. But yeah, my grandfather's words like really stick with me, because it's almost like there's like saying that great success is the best form of revenge. But I think like enduring optimism, even if it's blind optimism, is also a form of revenge.
It's lovely. No, I was thinking you talk a bit about the epigenetics of trauma and to think about the epigenetics of optimism, both that you carry with you and what your very beautiful, adorable daughters, not both of whom are in the book, Kari, but
one of them is in utero
in the book.
I just stop it somewhere. I was going to fast
Fair
forward,
enough,
and then Kamala Harris wins the presidency. Yay! The end.
She doesn't even get it.
We did it.
So we know she's there in our heart, but it's really lovely to think about them carrying this history, knowing this history, having this record of this history, and having the record of optimism. So that's what I was hoping to talk with you about, but we still have time to have a wonderful conversation with everyone else here. So if there's anything you want to say, ideally in question form, if it's in comment form, if you could kind of like land on a question mark.
Save it for the YouTube live stream comments. Yeah.
No microphones, so project and I will repeat it into the microphone. And do not be nervous. You've heard me mess things up as I've asked questions this evening, so the floor is yours. Yes.
I haven't read the book yet. I'm going to after I've received this copy. But I'm curious, hearing that sounds like so many family members of yours were natural historians, that they recorded so much, which I don't think is very common. I don't know. I don't have that much like ephemera of my family, and I'm curious if what you think about the motivation for that versus the motivation in you writing this book. Like, do you think that for your ancestors it was recording, and for you it was like processing, or how did you exercising, or would you say both were that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean,
we repeat the. Or I can.
Yeah,
one
repeat.
of us should for the live stream. So it was a very perceptive, wonderful question about this family of personal historians. You have three direct in your grandparents' generation, who recorded in detail their experience. And the question was, did you think that was for them, for their own experience, exercising the experiences somehow, and I think that was it. How do you think about?
Oh, and whether you think that motivation is the same as yours, or whether it gives you.
I mean, telling the story was the main drive for my grandparents and great grandparents. Like this was important to keep this information alive, that people don't forget what happened, that it stays in the record. And so that was a big part of it. I think that exercising personal demons was for them too, like a big part of this too, you know, like my Richter grandparents, the rabbi and my grandmother, you know, they told these stories endlessly, from my understanding, like, you know, paraded around the Midwest, where in charge of small congregations there, you know, like any Elks Lodge and, you know, Jewish community center and synagogue that would have them to, you know, to tell these stories, like they would do that. So for them, like it was a very, like, I think something also about telling a story again and again that crystallizes it in certain ways. And, you know, it's almost a way of like taking control and ownership of that story. Not just that, like, it's my story, I'm going to tell it, but I'm going to tell it in the way that, you know, helps me heal. And so, you know, so a lot of the book is about assessing memory, how we remember, why we remember, what we remember. And so, you know, I have plenty of annotations in my own voice that I put in my ancestor narratives, where I just, like, you know, sometimes, like, I question, like, well, you know, like, timing wise, this maybe didn't happen right now this way, or, you know, this seems like slightly suspect in like a, you know, like truth reality situation. But these were stories that were their personal truths. And, you know, and for me, like, in my telling of it too, it's through my narrative perspective. So it's also, you know, it's definitely, you know, tinted. I'm not a historian in any official sense. I am an artist, a memoirist. This is, you know, my interpretation of events, and using primary sources though. But, you know, I think to dovetail on that same question, you know, also the ephemera part of it, the collecting part, I think collecting was, for many of my relatives, kind of like also part of this process of healing. I mean, it's, you know, like, I think my mom's parents, Grandpa Jack and my Grandma Molly, they were kind of like hoarders more. I mean, they went to this open air flea market in New Jersey, Englishtown Flea Market, every weekend to amass more things for their house. And for them, I think it was a way of, like, you know, taking control. As for many hoarders, I'm sure, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, my parents were psychologists, but I think for a lot of hoarders, it's like, you know, a way of like taking control of your environment to try to control life that you're, you know, less in control of. Yeah.
It's also, I mean, it is a truly amazing story. I wonder, that might be part of the compulsion. I just, as you were talking about the traveling around the Midwest, I felt like there is a cameo that we missed, that if you could just mention the presidential cameo in the luck and history. Yeah.
Yeah, so when my Grandma Ruth, you know, changed Grandpa Carl's, like, little English quick to learn to English perfect,
yeah.
And then they accepted his, you know, his clergy visa to Springfield, Missouri. The then junior senator of Missouri, Harry Truman, was the one who directly sponsored them, because I guess you need to have some kind of a sponsor from a, you know, in the official sense. So the you know, not yet President Harry Truman was also very important to the survival narrative.
You gotta write that part down. Who else? Any other questions? Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. Often, you know, work is in direct conversation with what came before it, and, you know, when it comes to the graphic novel, obviously Mouse is probably one of the most successful graphic novels ever written in terms of crossover success. How did you sort of reckon with, like, either not being influenced by it, or, you know, trying to do something different, or, you know, being in conversation with it?
Yeah, so I'll repeat that question by saying there is a real mouse in the room, and that is Art Spiegelman's epic
I think
Holocaust memoir.
that joke got what it deserved.
Yeah, so Mouse.
Like, someone's gonna we debated who got to make that joke, and I was like, all right, you could take it.
I have the right to that joke. Mouse was clearly influential and inspirational for this book. It was definitely the first work of adult graphic literature I ever came across, when I stumbled upon it in Grandpa Jack's and Grandma Molly's Holocaust library, which they had an extensive just library about any book about the Holocaust and the Jewish diaspora experience. And I read it way too young to, you know, both absorb enough about it, but also gave me, you know, probably enough nightmares as a child. But it was definitely a very important text that I read, you know, in preparation for this book. I purposely did not reread it before I started writing this, because I didn't want it so in my head, because it's so, seminal. But, you know, what I always say in relation to Mouse is that was written 40 years ago, at least. You know, he started writing it, publishing it in Raw magazine in the 1970s, mid to late 70s, and through the late 80s. And so, you know, it's literally a generation before me. You know, he's the second generation. You know, it was his father's experience in the Holocaust. So, you know, that amount of time and that generational perspective is what, you know, gave me sort of like the self-permission to move forward and try to make, you know, my own version of this narrative, because, you know, a lot changes in a generation. A lot of perspective shifts, but some other inspirations. I looked a lot at the graphic memoirist Miriam Catton, who wrote 2 amazing graphic memoirs about her experience. One called "We Are on Our Own," about her experience with her mother as a child in Nazi-occupied Hungary and hiding from the Nazi authorities there through the war, and then her follow-up memoir called "Letting It Go," about trying to reckon with that past as an adult, which is actually my favorite of the 2. And another one I really want to shout out too is Nora Krug's Belonging. Nora Krug is a German-American artist, born in Germany, raised in Germany, non-Jewish German, who essentially went back to Germany to investigate her family's Nazi involvement during that time period. So I really see that book as almost like a mirror exploration of what I was trying to achieve in this book. Yes, sir, you. Handsome man in the corner, my father.
As you know, Mouse is banned in Florida schools. Are you looking forward to this as a rite of passage?
Florida, if you're watching on this live stream, get it while you can. No, you know, honestly, I wouldn't say I'm looking forward to it. It certainly could give me a publicity bump, but it's also, you know, it's a part and parcel of the sad state of politics and you know that we have in censorship in this country right now. And you know, maybe instead of seeing Art Spiegelman go on MSNBC, you know, vaping next time his book is banned, maybe you'll see me vaping on MSNBC.
From your lips. Who else? Yes.
Since you spoke about like this Holocaust graphic memoir tradition that you are following, I'm curious. I just have like a specific sort of formal comic question.
Yeah.
I notice you don't have gutters at all. That like you have no separation between the panels. And you mentioned your use of collage in your art outside of this narrative comic form. So I'm curious like what that decision making process was like for you and how you see collage functioning in this project.
Yeah, I'll repeat that. So why no gutters? And I'll try to explain that to people who are not comics people, and why collage. Okay, so gutters, and I am like, you know, I love comics. I grew up reading them. I am only, you know, since this project, a like cartoonist, and I'm still like getting myself comfortable with walking around and introducing myself as a cartoonist, as opposed to a fine artist, which is my training and what I teach. But so, you know, part of it is just, you know, some naivete, and not like why do you need separations between the panels? Because, you know, but otherwise I didn't necessarily.
Wait, sorry, we're talking about the white.
The white spaces between. I wasn't thinking as much panel to page. So from one side of a page to from left to right. And I have a lot of text that spans tiers. So I'm like, you know, I have text that's like, this is about what these 2 or 3 panels are referencing right underneath. So, and I also like, I want to give the reader a little bit of, you know, I don't want to think that you're too stupid to see the difference between like one color divider and another. You know, it's like this panel's blue, that one's brown. You can figure this out. So part of it's just like, I was like, I could have gone back after the fact, but I just, you know, like, it just didn't make as much sense to me. Now, collage is something that's very creatively, personally important to me. It's always been kind of like my sketching medium as an artist. And so basically, like, you know, ever since I was like a little kid, like my first like artworks that I'm aware of having made that were like things that, you know, were like in my oeuvre were these dried worm collages. I'd peel these worms off the cement in Florida, the hot pavement, and I would then glue them onto paper. But ever since then, I mean, collage has always been very, very central to like how I make images, and then I work over them. I reinvent the image on top. So it was just natural that each of these pages is just a Photoshop document with like 100 layers of stuff. it's like most of it's garbage, like layers that are turned off and stuff like that. It would probably, like, anyone who really knows these softwares would probably look at this and like totally just have a heart attack when they see how I put this together. But Fantagraphics is a great publisher, and they like knew how to like interpret all this garbage that I threw on the Photoshop document, and they made it work. And yeah, and that's the story of that.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, and then Ari will be able to sign your books. Anyone? Yes.
You.
Hi.
Hi, sir.
More of a riddle than a question.
Then I'll answer in a riddle.
So you allude obviously to the Tree of Life shooting, and also the daughter who's not featured in the story. Obviously you chose an endpoint in time, and since that endpoint in time, there have obviously been other things that have happened in the world that have been relevant to the idea of Jewish trauma and Jewish community trauma. Can you talk about sort of like you as a storyteller, how you thought about settling on that endpoint versus reopening it and reprocessing it?
Yeah, no, great question. So the question being, why did I end the book where I ended it? A good portion of it was because I had already spent 5 years writing and illustrating this thing, and I did not want to spend another 5 years on this. You know, it's enough time to be in the Holocaust, except for being in the Holocaust. That was actually a very inappropriate, edgy joke. I'll be less edgy with my answer from here. But so yeah, I had to end it somewhere. It basically, time-wise, if you don't know how old my children are, one's, you know, the eldest who just turned 4. But I basically end this right after Biden wins the 2020 election, and there's the January 6th. Yeah, there is like a little thing that happens. So like there's January 6th, there's like the big panel where like I compare, you know, like just visually, I'm like visually confused January 6th and the Munich Putsch, which just like blur into each other on the page. And but then after, like, there's no riots in the streets, it doesn't, the worst case scenario does not happen. Biden's inaugurated, and like we double down and find out that we're pregnant with our second kid, and that's the note of optimism that it ends on. But it's like, you know, it definitely opens itself to a sequel. I mean, I don't have that in my head, so don't ask me what that is. Next question. Clearly, there is a lot of time and a lot of, you know, history and a lot of things that have happened in these preceding, 4 years? How long has this been? 4 years. But I do not have a better answer beyond that. So thank you.
Well, it's
Sneak one in.
oh, yeah, sure.
Out of curiosity. So really, when you talked about this, I felt this emotion from you as you gathered all your family things. Now, when you did this, when you started this journey, was this journey for you, or your impending daughter, or all of us?
Yeah. Who did I make this book for? And that's also a really wonderful question. So, like, you know, it always started with me. There was something that I had to try to exercise, as I talked about before. And then, you know, it goes out to my family when I realized that my grandparents are no longer here to tell their own story. My parents are aging and not, you know, like necessarily they're not like creative writers and, you know, illustrators. So they're not like planning to tell the story. It's like it's on me to keep this information, to keep the story alive. So of course I want to make it for my children, for my children's cousins, my nephew sitting right here, for, you know, all the other cousins of various degrees of the different sides of the family. You know, it's for all of them, but it's, you know, the concentric circles go out from there. It's to the, you know, for the Jewish community. But it's also just for everybody. This is where the sales pitch is. It's, you know, it's about humanity, exploring empathy, and seeing how that can, you know, potentially make the world a little bit smaller.
That's a very good pitch.
Yeah.
Ari, congratulations.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you, Ari and Rachel, for such a great conversation. If you are with us on the YouTube live stream, please purchase Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz in the link below. And then for everybody here, if you turn, you can see my coworkers. They are pointing to where Ari is going to be signing. And if you make a neat line up the center aisle, things will go smoothly. And we will be packing things up, so make sure your belongings are with you. And other than that, thank you guys for such a wonderful night. Thank you so much.